Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending today's webinar, Building a Flexible, Challenge-Resistant, and Patient-Centric Clinical Supply Chain, presented by Catalent. I'm Ricardo Castano, and I'll be moderating this webinar. Our speakers today are Nicole Gray, Director of Strategic Supply Solutions at Catalent Pharma Solutions, and Stephen Flaherty, Global Director of Strategic Supply Solutions at Catalent Pharma Solutions. You can read their full bios on the left side of your window by selecting the Speakers tab. Just a few technical notes before we begin. This webcast is being streamed to your computer, so there is no dial-in number. For the best audio quality, please make sure your volume is up. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on demand within 24 hours after the event. Time permitting, we will follow the presentations with a Q&A session. Please submit your questions using the Questions and Answers tab on the left side of your screen. Okay, now let's begin. Stephen, please go ahead.
Thank you, and hello everyone. Thanks for joining this session. I'm very pleased to spend some time with you today, sharing some details of some new initiatives that have been deployed within our network, paying particular attention to how these can be leveraged in the current climate. Specifically, we'll be concentrating on two core initiatives: demand-led supply, or fast chain, and direct-to-patient, Flex Direct. We are all facing new challenges on a daily basis, nowhere more critically than in the clinical environment, managing evolving priorities with challenging resource levels across the globe. The leading imperative at all times must be ensuring and maintaining patient safety. We need to strike a balance between not subjecting patients to additional risk, but also maintaining continuity of care through what could be life-changing and in some cases life-saving clinical studies. Despite all the challenges with logistics, country lockdowns, supply chain difficulties, it is important now more than ever that we have the right material in the right place at the right time. During the next few slides, we'll explore strategies and solutions that allow us to maximize our resources, reduce waste, and ultimately provide as much support to patients and healthcare providers as is possible in these exceptionally challenging times. When we started this journey a few years ago, we asked ourselves some questions. What are the key challenges that our clients are faced with that we can address? And what do our patients deserve? Top of the list was, how do we improve timelines? How can we start studies earlier? How can we recruit patients faster? How can we add new countries quicker? And how can we get products to market sooner? Next came inventory management. How can we reduce the large amount of wastage both in product we manufacture and compared to product we need to purchase? In many cases, these products are processed in large quantities. They're packaged, sometimes repackaged, distributed, and all too often, to add insult to injury, we need to pay to have large portions of this extremely expensive material destroyed. Are there labeling techniques and technologies, including e-labels, smart packs, that we can deploy to measure compliance or to improve compliance, to assist in identification and coding of kits and verification of kit structures? And last but by no means least, how do we make clinical trials more accessible and less intrusive for patients? I'm going to concentrate on the top two areas of the graphic today. Firstly, creating a decentralized framework, what that means and the benefits that can be derived from it. Secondly, now how we've built an on-demand model, enabling the pooling of stock across multiple protocols, describing some of the key attributes of both these models. I'll also spend some time discussing how these models are able to fit extremely well with the requirements for the new generation of advanced therapeutic medicinal products that are being developed, and there is growth in this with this sector. Decentralized supplies, I'd class this as having the right material in the right place at the right time. In this approach, we locate bright stock globally to support a program. Material is transferred to the region from the start of the program and available to support new protocols immediately as they are authorized. This is more important than ever before in the current climate to have the product close to the end user and give confidence that the material will be there when required. Each depot works to a globally harmonized procedure using global templates for batch records and forms. We support the depot with a central team that coordinates demand and capacity planning. The team also performs central functions such as pack and label design, master data setup. For each country, we have generated a logistics profile which identifies the most appropriate hub to support that country, details standard shipping times and additional information required when setting up the supply plan, such as import license timing, pass-through depot requirements. Depending on the countries participating, we can perform a pure demand-led approach or hybrid approach, incorporating depot stock held locally for some countries. As per traditional models, we use simulation tools to help define study parameters and stock requirements. The difference in the demand-led approach is we plan supply availability at a country level and to a regular packaging rhythm for that country. We can then modify each campaign in real time, dependent on the product availability and utilization, therefore never overproducing and maintaining stocks throughout the supply chain at the optimal level. In the traditional approach, packaged stock is available on the shelf and the IRT trigger is set to accommodate transit times to ensure the product is available for each dispensation visit. In the demand-led approach, the trigger happens a few days earlier to accommodate the final packaging activity prior to shipment. The end result is that the site does not see any difference in medication availability. How does demand-led supply affect inventory levels? In any study, there is the most variability and unpredictability through the enrollment phase. In certain cases, a hybrid approach between demand-led and traditional supply chains may be the most effective method. In this example, the blue curve represents the demand and reaches steady state at or around month 20. From this point onwards, demand is defined and predictable to the end of the study. By utilizing a demand-led approach over the first 19 months, we manufacture and commit just what is required and are able to adjust volumes throughout the packaging cycle based upon uptake and actual demand. At month 20, we can then cover all remaining supplies with larger campaigns, knowing that the demand is well established and fixed, and thereby benefit from the economies of scale that packaging in large campaigns through centralized hubs bring. With an on-demand approach, we're able to more accurately pinpoint demand at each of the sites and provide material to the site closer to when the product is needed, with more confidence material will be available when needed. A more targeted approach means less shipments with lower costs. In a traditional approach, kit ranges are allocated in advance and stock is manufactured in bulk up front and pushed through from central sites to depots. The IRT can then allocate stock at depots to pick from to fulfill requests. In a demand-led environment, we have no stock to pick from. We receive IRT requests for a quantity of kits of each pack type. We hold and manage one randomization centrally within our systems. When orders are raised, we aggregate these orders at a country level. We then call off the next set of sequence numbers from the randomization dynamically, irrespective of the country we are packing for or the hub we are packaging at. If kit IDs were to be pre-allocated to countries or regions, this would become very complicated when we aggregate orders and need to access different parts of the randomization list, making both printing and packaging control less efficient. After the packaging activity, we notify the IRT which kits have been packaged. The IRT validates this against their list in the system, and we receive an also confirmation within seconds that allows the shipment to proceed. I mentioned aggregation quite a lot. And to give a further example of what we do in our aggregation system, I can explain it easy with this simple model. To be able to scale our solution, we have developed systems which aggregate demand from multiple centres for an extended lookout period at a country level. We combine these supply order requests into aggregated assembly orders and then reassociate the stock from the original request to fulfill a shipment order in the production environment. This means we minimize the number of packaging campaigns, batch records, and releases we need to process. It also means supplies are ready for shipment when they are available from production following release. No need to pick and repack. Here, rather than 6 packaging activities and batch records and releases, we consolidate it down to 2. Imagine the benefits to this process when we have 200 centres set up in one country, each providing real-time demand. The actual packaging activity, this needs to be done quickly with as much automated verification and control as possible. We have developed several processes globally to assist speed and verification. Throughout the whole supply chain, we depend on barcode verification to ensure correct construction of the kits, correct label application, and ultimately correct distribution to the clinic. Since we are packaging to order, we can label with the appropriate single language for the country. This also enables us to add new countries quickly when we need to expand or support enrolment. We also label with the latest expiry date, an important benefit for early phase studies which can have expiry dates extended throughout the duration of the study. Pooling batches at a program level across multiple protocols allows us to pack the first material to expire, making most efficient use of supplies. We use globally harmonized batch records and procedures throughout our facilities. Packaging instructions are raised once and approved for a pack type. These are translated where needed, and then this is supplemented for each packaging job with the aggregated order, variable data that we capture through our system. Where possible and to enable scale, we look to share data and grow data as much as we can. This is much better than duplicating, re-entering, or regenerating data. To support this, we utilize web interfaces or have developed data integration models with sponsors and stakeholders. We are supporting an increasing number of new clinical trials for advanced therapies such as cell and gene. Fast chain solutions got many benefits to the process that can be utilized by these types of studies. In these studies, the material is typically in very short supply and in all cases very expensive, so it is critical not to waste even one vial of product. Patient kits are often variable in size and need to be manufactured based upon the weight of the patient. Once the patient has been identified and has passed through screening, then we need to supply very quickly a personalized medication kit. These are often global studies, so the patient can present anywhere in the world. Having pooled supplies in a regional hub supported by a global team and network allows us to process these orders in an expedited manner. We ensure that we have approval and QP release as far along the manufacturing cycle as possible. That way, it is just the final clinical label application and review that needs to happen to allow us to provide QP release and ship in an expedited manner. So, in summary, we see a traditional approach as a push model, building up kit stocks and inventory and materials supplied from a central location in line with site initiation visits. With a decentralized demand-led approach, we have a pull model where we manufacture based on actual patient demand as close as possible, physically and time-wise, to where and when the medication needs to be provided. We can then add our direct-to-patient processes to either the traditional or demand-led approach, and Nicole is going to take you through that now.
Thank you, Stephen. Hi, everyone. My name is Nicole Gray, and I'll be speaking to you today about direct-to-patient. So we'll start by looking at decentralized clinical trials, or DCTs. Centralized clinical trials, or traditional trials, are conducted at designated study sites, and all procedures are generally performed by investigators and their delegated personnel. Subject visits take place at these sites during face-to-face visits for the investigator and study staff. Standard, traditional clinical trial model. However, advances in technology have opened the door to the DCT model, in which some or all study-related procedures can take place away from the investigator site, either via telemedicine or via local healthcare provider, such as your primary care physician, a pharmacist, a clinic, a home-based care model, or a regional hospital. Although they've received more attention recently, decentralized trials are definitely not new. Some were successfully conducted as early as the 1980s, and hundreds have been conducted since. These trials have been both hybrid models and 100% decentralized or DCT. Smartphones, tablets, web browser access, or televisits and electronic records are making it easier for patients and study staff to communicate and stay in touch real time. With the advancement in technology, the potential is virtually unlimited and improving constantly. Home healthcare providers, nurses, mobile phlebotomists, and other local healthcare providers are all part of the solution. The investigator always remains the lead medical professional that conducts the clinical trial, so that's true in a standard or a decentralized model. It is under the investigator's lead that the drug is dispensed or administered to a patient. This should not change and does not change in the DCT. In a DCT, even if no patient ever physically visits the site, there is still a clinical site, and this is where the investigator is located or licensed to practice medicine and conduct a clinical trial. To reiterate, the site is the address of the investigator, and this is where the investigator conducts, oversees, and coordinates all decentralized related clinical trial activity. So what is patient versus site to patient? One piece of a DCT is a direct-to-patient distribution. As I'm sure you know, the industry has been referring to DTP as all-inclusive, meaning direct-to-patient either from the clinical site or from a pharmacy or depot. I'd like to separate the two for the rest of this presentation to make it clear that when I refer to STP, I mean site-to-patient, where the clinical site arranges and ships the product to the patient's home. And for DTP, I mean we bypass the clinical site altogether and ship the product directly to the patient's home from the pharmacy. It's important to note that protocols should include DTP or STP in order to accommodate certain patients for emergencies. There are waivers possible for one-off shipments, but this could become complicated and cumbersome compared to planning up front. So the ability to ship clinical trial supplies to a patient's home as part of a traditional site-based model or a fully decentralized model via pharmacy to the patient or via clinical site to the patient. DTP and STP can apply to all shipments for all patients, some shipments for all patients, some shipments for some patients, and in emergency situations only. So a true patient-centric model should be flexible depending on the protocol and the patient's specific needs. You may have a patient that decides they never want to visit the clinical site and they would prefer to have everything shipped to their home, whereas you may have patients who would always prefer to go to the site or at least want to go to the site some of the time. So why is DTP important to patients? DTP is a patient-centric approach. Trials that may not have been available to some patients due to region or location suddenly become available without having to uproot their lives and their families in order to participate. For example, a patient can choose to join a trial being run out of California when they're physically located in New Jersey, and so on. Transporting the drug. As we all know, we spend a lot of time and effort to maintain those GMP conditions and proper drug storage. But when a patient carries their drug home, stops at the grocery store, leaves it in the car, there goes that 2 to 8 condition that we work so hard to maintain. People such as us on this call possibly have to balance work, families, and commitments. It's difficult to rearrange the schedule for a face-to-face visit, but having drugs delivered at home is much more convenient. A recent Tufts study indicated that 60% of patients chose not to participate in a clinical trial due to a perceived burden of participation. And as far back as 2014, an ISPE study explored patient attitudes toward home delivery options for repeat prescriptions or refills in clinical trials. And 78% of patients indicated it would be helpful to have those medications delivered to their home versus traveling to the clinical site. The DTP option could open up participation to a much more broad and more diverse patient population. So, as we all know, COVID-19 has had a big impact on all of our lives, and clinical trials are no exception to that. So with COVID-19 impact, patients have been unable or unwilling to travel to a clinical site. Vulnerable populations really should be sheltering in place and not leaving their home as much as possible. Clinical sites in some regions have actually had to close. And really, at this point in time, there's no clear end to our new way of life. So some of the potential DTP advantages: DTP allows for fewer or no visits to a clinical site. Patients don't need to leave their home at all, putting themselves or others at risk. Supports patient retention and protects patient safety. Best practices to support some DTP: you could set up a virtual visit with patients on the day of their scheduled delivery. Consider a quiz for the patient to confirm their understanding of how to take the drug and how to report an adverse event. So lots of different ways to do this using the telemedicine platforms that are available to all of us today. So why is DTP important to clinical sites and sponsors? Obviously, it could help with patient recruitment, and it could help increase retention, broadens the patient access and demographics, opens up trial participation to patients in remote areas, and reduces geographic barriers, assists recruitment, increases access to patients with rare diseases, could help support patient compliance and adherence because they don't miss visits. Investigator site staff does not need to dispense the product, so this helps reduce the storage burden on the clinical site, alleviates the product stability concerns from site to the patient's home, and may help to decrease overall trial costs. So initially, when we look at the cost of maybe using a premium carrier for direct-to-patient, that may seem higher. But when we look at the big picture of, travel and site visits, dispensing, storage, the need to buy certain refrigerator space or something else for the clinical site, this overall approach may help decrease overall trial costs. So when we look at the regulations, general regulation states that the IND drugs are covered by the CFR, but the CFR does not preempt state law. State law requires that only a doctor or a pharmacist can dispense drugs. When the clinical site shifts to a patient's home, the doctor or investigator is dispensing that drug to the patient. When we look at the pharmacy-specific regulations, a pharmacy shipping to a patient's home, the pharmacist is the one dispensing that drug to the patient. So they do that at the request of the investigator. Pharmacies must be licensed in the state in which they are shipping into and out of. So you have a home state resident license and a non-resident license. Some states require that pharmacists themselves also be licensed in the state which they are shipping into. Some require what's called a pharmacist in charge. There are currently 15 states that require this, and several others that are looking into this now. This is current thinking on state law and DTP shipments of clinical drugs. The FDA may get involved and work with the states to change this in the future, but as of right now, state laws require a pharmacist in order to ship direct to patient to the state. The investigator remains the responsible party for medical care of the patient. The pharmacy dispenses at the direction of the investigator. And as in a traditional trial, patient safety is always key. The standards for DTP and DCT are the same as for traditional and centralized trials. In all cases, the patient must be clear on whom to contact and the proper procedure to follow to report any symptoms or medical concerns. So when we look at DTP and STP for the rest of the world outside the U.S., most studies have been site-to-patient. STP and DTP approvals have historically been sponsor protocol and patient population dependent. Either model requires approvals in each country. Local laws also need to be considered in these cases. For example, many countries require a pharmacy and a licensed pharmacist for DTP. It's recommended that each country has a separate supply plan that helps to maintain flexibility and amend supply plans needed rather than the entire protocol. You may choose to do direct-to-patient in the U.S. and site-to-patient in other parts of the world, and then traditional in some other countries. So as we all know, like I said, COVID-19 has significantly changed the landscape for DTP and STP, and most countries are now allowing it. It remains to be seen if this will be a permanent change, but is likely to open up more possibilities for future studies. So Catalent's approach to direct-to-patient and site-to-patient is called FlexDirect. So in order to meet the needs of patients and customers and remain compliant to state laws within the United States, Catalent has recently announced an on-site pharmacy within the Philadelphia packaging, storage, and distribution site. Due to the physical location of the pharmacy within the GMP storage and distribution facility, the need to split supplies between traditional and the DTP model is eliminated. The pharmacy is able to compliantly ship direct to patients across the U.S. with the oversight of a pharmacist in charge. The FlexDirect model will allow for a true mix of traditional STP and DTP shipments for whatever combination your study and patients need. So the FlexDirect model allows for a hybrid mix of traditional site shipments, site-to-patient shipments, and direct-to-patient shipments from the pharmacy, or 100% site or direct-to-patient. So it doesn't need to be decided up front which patient is going to have direct-to-patient, which is going to have site-to-patient, which is going to have traditional. It's 100% flexible, and it's set up based on how the IVR sends our shipments. So what are the benefits of utilizing Catalent's direct-to-patient pharmacy within the U.S.? Your supplies remain flexible and on-site at Catalent, available to use for traditional site or depot shipments, STP or DTP shipments. There's no wasted inventory at the clinical sites that may not be recruiting. One shipment from Catalent Pharmacy directly to a patient versus a site shipment and then a patient shipment in the STP model. Supplies are picked and packed in GMP conditions by Catalent-trained professionals. Less work for your clinical sites. There's no receipt, no storage, carrier booking, or shipment to deal with, as in the STP model. Catalent handles all carrier booking and works with the carrier to schedule the shipment with the patient, and that is completely blinded to everybody outside of the pharmacy as far as patient name and address. Catalent Pharmacy works directly with the clinical site on the prescription, queries, etc. Shipments can be tracked blinded to patient information via our Fusion Insight suite, and it may help reduce clinical site fees, like we were saying, storage, visits, and handling of material. So the future of direct-to-patient. Direct-to-patient DTP and STP model services have benefits for patients, sponsors, and clinical trials now more than ever. Due to COVID-19, many more sponsors are now planning for inclusion of some form of DTP in their future protocols and ongoing protocols. Regulations and approval processes for DTP can vary from country to country, and some have changed rapidly over the past few months. Some countries have relaxed regulations in order to maintain patient access to critical medications due to COVID-19, and it remains to be seen if these changes are temporary or will eventually become permanent. And when I say relax, obviously I don't mean patient safety concerns. Patient safety is always key, regardless of how the regulations have changed, and we need to be able to show that to the authorities. Compliance with local regulations is imperative. Always check prior to executing DTP, not after. Again, I can't say it enough. Patient safety remains the #1 priority in all of these scenarios. Including provision for direct-to-patient into a study protocol can provide sponsors with future flexibility and avoid any last-minute rushes to execute. So going forward, consider including that in every protocol if it's safe for the patient to do so. That way, we don't have to rush in the cases of, local lockdowns or so on. So that was all I had today. So, Rick, I'll pass it back to you, please.
Now let's move on to the Q&A. There is still time to submit your questions using the Q&A tab to the left side of your screen. We have a lot of great questions already, and we will try to get to as many as possible. So let's see. Our first question here today is for Nicole. It asks, does the IRB have to approve any documents that are used for STP or DTP?
Thanks, Rick. Yes. So keep in mind that some IRBs are going to want to see whatever kind of possible carrier paperwork or other paperwork that may be included in a DTP shipment, such as, what is the patient signing at the time of delivery or so on. So this will vary country to country, IRB to IRB, so you need to have those conversations at the time of setting up your study.
All right, thank you. Let's see. Our next question asks, also for Nicole, how do you know if you're delivering to the right person?
So if you're using a premium carrier, in most cases, what they're going to be doing is when you're booking the shipment, you need to either include the patient's name or an authorized representative at the time of booking. And then when the carrier delivers it, they're going to only deliver to that patient or their authorized representative. So never to a minor. And I know pre-COVID, it was always standard practice to request an ID, have the patient sign. During COVID, some carriers are doing things a little differently, but they're always asking, for the person they're delivering to or asking the person's name that answers the door and so on. So it's important to know that if you're delivering to an authorized representative, whether that be a family member, a caretaker, a visiting nurse, or so on, that whoever it is you're having that package received by is listed on the booking form.
Awesome, thank you. And one more for you, Nicole, here. How does offering a DTP option impact IRT setup?
Okay, so lots of different ways to look at this, depending on whether you're doing hybrid model or 100% DCT or STP. But some of the things to keep in mind will be your IVR's ability to be flexible in sending traditional site-based or depot-based shipment requests versus direct-to-patient shipment requests. We want to maintain privacy as much as possible in these scenarios, so we always want to send as little information as possible for where we're delivering to for the patient. So in the case of Catalent, we have the pharmacy receive the patient information, where our standard distribution team receives the blinded to the patient ship request. Something else to consider: do not dispense dates, expiration dates, and so on. When you're dispensing for DTP, you need to think about the dispense date as being the date that the patient is receiving it, not the date it's being shipped, because there could be a day or two delay or a couple days delay even between when it's requested, when it's shipped, and when it's received by the patient. And as I was saying earlier about the check-in visit the day of delivery, you could have your clinical site, quote-unquote, receiving those shipments on behalf of the patient. Something else to keep in mind, especially in things like titration studies and so on, your expiration date. You want to make sure that your patient is not holding on to drugs that's going to expire during the course of their treatment. So we need to think a little bit more about how we're dispensing those drugs and how long that patient's going to have it, including the time for shipment. So lots of different ways and things to consider there. But if you're working with a IRT that has experience with direct-to-patient, they should be able to help you through that during the setup phase. Hopefully I answered that good, Rick.
All right, Nicole. No, thank you. The answers, they seem pretty good on my end, so I do just want to go on to the next questions here and invite everyone who does have any other questions to please feel free to do so here in the by asking a question in the Q&A tab to the left side of the screen. And our next question here is for Stephen. And Stephen, if you have anything that you'd like to add on to Nicole's questions, please feel free to do so. But our next question here is, which types of studies are most suited to demand lead supply?
That's a great question. Thank you very much. In our experience, we've packaged all different types of studies, so from phase 1 through to phase 3. As I mentioned in the presentation, we're starting to see a lot now of advanced therapy studies that are getting the benefits from demand-led supply. I suppose where we would struggle would be if there was a study that had a scheduled product, and obviously where you need to export to multiple countries, then that may be problematic if you're setting decentralized hubs. But on the whole, all different dosage types, all different study types, all get benefits out of using a demand-led supply scenario.
All right, thank you, Stephen. Let's see, our next question here asks, what type of savings have been generated using the model?
Another good question. I suppose the biggest saving that we see is reducing the overage. So a typical traditional approach, you may have 40, 50, in some cases 100% overage. When we deploy a demand-led decentralized model, we can get that overage down to less than 20%, in some cases far less than 20%. And with the advanced therapeutics, we get it down to 0%. So literally every vial of product that is manufactured and used is used in a patient kit for a specific patient. So by far and away, the reduction in the amount of drug product that we use, and also some of the phase 3 studies were, particularly in oncology, where you have very expensive comparators, reducing that overage and reducing that cost can give many savings, tens of or hundreds of thousands of dollars per study based on the amount of comparator product that you purchase or that you don't need to purchase because you're managing the supply so tightly.
All right, thank you so much. And this looks like it'll be our final question today. We had a lot of great questions already, and we couldn't get to them all, but we will try our best to get back to everyone who submitted personally after the webinar. And Stephen, this question asks, does this generate a lot of paperwork? And if so, how do you control it?
So I suppose because the difference between demand-led and traditional is that we're doing lots of smaller batches more often, then yes, there is more paperwork that we generate. But we were conscious of that from the start of developing the model and deploying the model across our network. And we've really put a lot of effort into trying to minimize that burden. So things like simplifying the batch record that we use, having a standard batch record that all the sites use and that our QA are very comfortable with, and that gives them the right and the essential information and pairs it down to just that essential information to be able to release the product. We look to automate as much as possible, so introducing scan assembly to make sure that we have system controls that tell us that the right drug has been packed with the right label and has been constructed into the right kit and is ready for distribution to the right clinic, and all that systematic control gives our QA team a lot of confidence that the approach has been carried out correctly and that we followed GMP and the necessary requirements. And we also, one of the other aspects is we try and do as much in terms of release up front as possible. So for any large phase 3 study where we've produced and manufactured drug and we've done the primary packaging, we would aim to have our QP review and release, our QA review and release as far as possible along that chain. And then it's only really the final application that needs a review before we release it and ship it. So I suppose all in all, it's introducing systems, introducing technology, and trying to make it the paperwork as simple and as clear as possible to reduce that burden.
All right, Stephen. Well, thank you so much for giving us such a thorough and detailed response. And with that, I would like to thank everyone for attending this Fierce Biotech webinar and for submitting so many great questions. Again, I'd like to thank Stephen and Nicole for participating, and I'd like to thank Catalent for presenting today's webinar. Remember, this webinar has been recorded. You will be able to access the recording within 24 hours using the same audience link that was sent to you earlier. Thank you again for joining, and we look forward to seeing you at future events.